The candles had barely settled into their steady glow when the Duke's voice cut through the dining hall like a blade through silk. "Leave the table." Every fork stopped moving. Every glass paused halfway to every mouth. 30 guests, dressed in silk and velvet, turned their heads toward the far end of the long oak table, where Alina Hartley sat frozen, her hands still folded politely in her lap. Julian Ashford, Duke of Camden Hall, did not raise his voice again. He did not need to. His pale gray eyes fixed on Alina with a coldness that seemed to drain the warmth from the entire room. The fire crackled in the hearth behind him, throwing long shadows across the polished floor, but nothing in his expression softened. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace." Alina's voice came out steadier than she felt. Her heart pounded so hard she was certain the woman beside her could hear it. "You heard me perfectly well," Julian said. "Quit the table now." A ripple of murmurs spread down the table like wind through tall grass. Lady Pembroke, seated near the center, pressed a gloved hand to her mouth. Lord Whitfield, an old friend of the family, set down his wine glass with a soft, uncomfortable clink. Nobody spoke in Alina's defense. Nobody dared. Alina's cheeks burned, but she kept her spine straight as she rose from her chair. She had been a guest at Camden Hall for only 3 weeks, brought in quietly by the Dowager Duchess Constance as a companion. A woman of modest means with impeccable manners, and a mysterious past that nobody at the estate had bothered to question. Until now. "May I ask what I have done to offend you, Your Grace?" Alina asked, her chin lifted despite the humiliation crawling up her neck. Julian did not answer. He simply looked past her, toward the tall arched windows at the end of the hall, as though searching for something in the darkness beyond the glass. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face, not anger, but something closer to fear. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. "I will not repeat myself a third time," he said quietly. Alina's breath caught. She glanced once around the table, searching for a single sympathetic face. Lady Margaret Ashford, the Duke's younger sister, met her eyes briefly, and in that glance Alina saw something unexpected, not pity but worry. Real worry. Without another word, Alina turned and walked from the dining hall, her footsteps echoing against the marble floor. She kept her head high until she passed through the tall double doors, and only then did her composure begin to crack. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against the cool stone wall of the corridor outside. She did not understand. She had done nothing wrong. She had followed every rule of etiquette the Dowager Duchess had drilled into her over the past weeks, which fork to use, when to speak, when to remain silent. She had said barely 10 words during the entire meal. And yet the Duke, a man who had scarcely looked at her twice since her arrival, had just humiliated her in front of the most important families in the county. Footsteps approached from behind, quick and light. Alina turned, expecting a servant, but instead found herself face to face with a young maid named Grace, who cast a nervous glance over her shoulder before speaking. "Miss Hartley," Grace whispered, "you should go to your room quickly if you please." "Why, what is happening?" Alina asked. Grace hesitated, wringing her hands. "I cannot say, miss, but His Grace would not have done such a thing without reason. He is not a cruel man. Something is wrong tonight. I can feel it in the air." Before Alina could press further, the sound of the great front doors opening echoed through the entrance hall. Carriage wheels crunched against gravel outside, and the low murmur of new voices drifted in from the courtyard. Grace's eyes widened. "She has arrived," Grace said almost to herself. "Who has arrived?" Alina asked, but Grace was already hurrying away toward the servants' staircase, leaving Alina alone in the dim corridor with nothing but the flickering candlelight and the distant hum of the dinner she had just been forced to leave. Alina pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breathing. She thought of the letter tucked beneath the floorboard of her bedroom upstairs, the one she had read 100 times since arriving at Camden Hall. A warning, written in her mother's hand, telling her never to reveal her true name to anyone within these walls. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that she was safe here, that no one at Camden Hall knew who she truly was. Now standing alone in the shadows, she was no longer certain. The front doors swung open fully, and a gust of cool night air swept into the hall, carrying with it the scent of rain and horses. A woman stepped inside, tall and elegant, wrapped in a deep emerald traveling cloak that seemed to shimmer even in the low light. Her dark hair was pinned beneath a delicate hat, and her posture carried the unmistakable confidence of someone born into privilege and never once made to doubt it. Alina recognized her immediately, though they had never formally met. Lady Seraphina Vane, the Duke's betrothed. Seraphina's sharp eyes swept across the entrance hall and landed briefly on Alina, who stood half hidden in the shadow of a marble column. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Seraphina's gaze held no hostility, no curiosity even, only a strange, unreadable calm, as though she already understood something Alina did not. Then Seraphina smiled politely, inclined her head in a small greeting, and swept past toward the dining hall as though she had been expected all along. Alina's stomach twisted. Something about the encounter felt staged, rehearsed even, though she could not explain why. She pressed herself further into the shadows and watched as a footman rushed forward to announce the new arrival, his voice carrying clearly down the corridor. "Lady Seraphina Vane," he called out, and the doors to the dining hall opened wide to receive her. Curiosity overpowered caution. Alina crept closer to the doorway, careful to remain out of sight, and peered through the narrow gap between the door and its frame. The scene inside had transformed entirely. Where moments ago the table had sat in stunned, uncomfortable silence following Alina's dismissal, now it buzzed with polite excitement as guests rose to greet the newly arrived lady. Seraphina moved through the room with practiced grace, offering warm smiles and gentle words to each guest in turn, as though she were the very sun around which the entire gathering orbited. And then, without hesitation, without so much as a glance toward the Duke for permission, Seraphina walked directly to the chair Alina had vacated only minutes before. She settled into it smoothly, arranging her skirts with the calm precision of a woman who had done this 1,000 times, and reached for the wine glass that had been left untouched beside the empty plate. Alina watched, frozen, as the Duke's expression shifted. It was subtle, so subtle that anyone not watching closely would have missed it entirely. His jaw tightened. His fingers curled slightly against the tablecloth. He did not look at Seraphina at all. His gaze remained fixed on the empty doorway through which Alina had disappeared, as though he were waiting for something or someone. "Shall we continue the meal?" Seraphina asked brightly, her voice carrying easily across the table. "I do apologize for my tardiness. The roads from Bristol were dreadful this evening." A ripple of polite laughter answered her, and the tension that had gripped the room only moments before seemed to dissolve entirely, replaced by the comfortable rhythm of aristocratic conversation. Forks resumed their gentle clinking against fine china. Wine was poured. Someone made a joke about the unpredictable English weather, and the table laughed again. It was as if Alina had never existed at all. She stepped back from the door, her chest tight with a confusion she could not name. Humiliation, yes, but beneath it something stranger, a prickling sense that she had witnessed not an accident, but a performance. Every movement, from the Duke's harsh command to Seraphina's perfectly timed arrival, felt choreographed, deliberate, as though the entire dinner had been staged around her removal from that chair. But why? What possible reason could the Duke have for orchestrating something so calculated, so public, so cruel? She turned to make her way back toward the staircase, intending to retreat to her room as Grace had urged, when a hand closed gently but firmly around her wrist. Alina gasped and spun around, ready to defend herself, only to find Lady Margaret standing before her, having slipped out of the dining hall through a side passage. Margaret's usually cheerful face was drawn tight with worry, her blue eyes darting nervously toward the dining hall doors. "You must come with me," Margaret whispered urgently. "Quickly, before anyone notices we are both missing." "Lady Margaret, I don't understand what is happening," Alina said, her voice barely above a whisper. Your brother humiliated me in front of the entire county, and now his betrothed has simply taken my seat as though nothing at all occurred. What is going on? Margaret glanced over her shoulder once more before pulling Alina down a narrow servants' corridor, away from the prying eyes of the main hall. The passage was dim, lit only by a single flickering lamp mounted on the stone wall, and the sudden quiet after the noise of the dinner felt almost eerie. "I cannot explain everything tonight," Margaret said, her voice low and urgent. "But I need you to trust me when I tell you that my brother did not humiliate you out of cruelty." "Then why?" Alina demanded, frustration finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure. "Why would he do such a thing if not to embarrass me?" Margaret hesitated, glancing toward the dining hall once more as though the walls themselves might be listening. "There is a man at that table tonight who should not know your name. A man who has been searching for you, Alina, for a very long time. My brother recognized him the moment he arrived, and he had only seconds to act before that man realized exactly who was sitting across the table from him." The blood drained from Alina's face. Her mother's warning, folded and worn beneath the floorboard upstairs, echoed suddenly in her mind. "Never reveal your name. Never let them find you." "Who is he?" Alina whispered, though some part of her already dreaded the answer. "The man at the table, who is he?" Margaret's eyes filled with something close to pity. "I do not know his full history, only what my brother has told me in fragments. But I know this much. His name is Lord Edmund Crane, and he has spent the better part of 2 years searching every corner of England for a woman matching your exact description." The lamp on the wall flickered, casting trembling shadows across Margaret's pale face, and somewhere beyond the thick stone walls, the sound of polite laughter drifted faintly from the dining hall, as though the world inside those doors remained entirely untouched by the danger creeping steadily closer to the woman standing frozen in the shadows. Alina's knees weakened, and she reached out to steady herself against the cold stone wall. 2 years. He had been searching for 2 years, and she had believed, foolishly, that changing her name and hiding within the walls of a stranger's estate would be enough to keep her safe forever. "I need to leave," Alina said suddenly, pulling away from Margaret's grip. "Tonight, before he sees me again, before he realizes." "No," Margaret said firmly, catching her arm once more. "If you run now alone in the dark, you will only make yourself easier to find. My brother has a plan, Alina. You must trust him, even if his methods tonight seemed harsh. Everything he did at that table was meant to protect you." Somewhere down the corridor, a door creaked open and both women froze. Footsteps echoed against the stone floor, slow and deliberate, drawing steadily closer through the darkness. Margaret's hand tightened around Alina's wrist, and for the first time since the ordeal began, Alina saw genuine fear flash across the younger woman's face. "Someone is coming," Margaret breathed. "We cannot be found here together." The footsteps stopped just around the corner, and a shadow stretched long and thin across the stone floor, creeping steadily closer with every passing second, while Alina stood frozen in the darkness, unable to tell whether the figure approaching belonged to a friend or to the very danger she had spent 2 years running from. The shadow stopped just short of the corner, and a familiar voice broke the silence. "Margaret, Alina, come out." "It is only me." Both women released their held breath at once as Julian Ashford stepped into the dim light of the servants' corridor, his dark coat still buttoned formally from dinner, though his cravat had been loosened as though he had torn at it in frustration. His pale gray eyes found Alina immediately, and for the briefest moment, the coldness that had defined his expression at the table melted into something far more human. Relief, perhaps, or guilt. "Your Grace," Alina said stiffly, straightening her posture though her heart still hammered against her ribs. "Perhaps now you would care to explain yourself." Julian glanced down the corridor behind him, checking that they were truly alone before answering. "There is no time for a full explanation tonight. Lord Crane will grow suspicious if I remain away from the table too long, but I need you to understand one thing clearly, Miss Hartley. I did not humiliate you for sport." "Then what was it for?" Alina's voice cracked slightly despite her effort to remain composed. You embarrassed me in front of 30 guests. You did not even offer an explanation. I walked out of that hall feeling as though I had committed some terrible offense, and now your sister tells me a man is hunting me, and you knew this the entire time. I recognized him the instant he walked through my doors this afternoon, Julian said, his voice low and urgent. Edmund Crane has been asking questions in 3 counties about a young woman fitting your description. Fair hair, gray eyes, a slight accent from the western counties that most people would never notice unless they were listening for it specifically. He arrived at Camden Hall uninvited, claiming an old friendship with my late father, and I had only moments to decide how to keep him from noticing you before he took his seat at that table. Alina's mind raced backward through the events of the evening. She had barely spoken during dinner. She had kept her eyes lowered, her voice quiet, exactly as she had been taught. And yet Julian's harsh command had come mere minutes after Crane's arrival at the estate. You could have warned me privately, Alina said. You could have sent word through Grace or through your sister. Instead, you chose to humiliate me before the entire county. A private warning would have taken time I did not have, Julian said. Crane was already seated at that table, watching every face in the room. Had I pulled you aside quietly, had I whispered anything to you at all, his suspicion would have followed us both instantly. A public dismissal, harsh as it seemed, gave him nothing to question. A companion sent away for a breach of etiquette is unremarkable. A private word between the Duke and a mysterious guest is exactly the sort of thing a man like Crane would notice and remember. Alina wanted to argue further, wanted to demand 100 more answers, but something in Julian's explanation settled uncomfortably close to logic. She thought of Crane's reputation, whispered about in fragments by servants throughout the estate over the past 3 weeks, a man known for his sharp instincts and his relentless pursuit of anyone who owed him money, favors, or worse. And Lady Seraphina, Alina asked instead, was her arrival also part of this performance? For the first time since stepping into the corridor, Julian hesitated. He glanced at his sister, who offered no help, her lips pressed into a thin, worried line. Seraphina's arrival tonight was planned before you ever came to Camden Hall, Julian said carefully. But her timing tonight worked in our favor. The moment she took your seat, every eye in that room shifted toward her instead of toward the empty chair where you had been sitting. Crane's attention moved with the rest of the table. By the time he thought to ask who had occupied that seat before her, the conversation had already turned elsewhere. Alina crossed her arms, studying the Duke's face carefully in the dim lamplight. You make it sound remarkably convenient, Your Grace, as though every piece fell perfectly into place at precisely the right moment. Convenient does not mean effortless, Julian said, and for the first time that evening, something like exhaustion crept into his voice. I have spent the past 3 hours arranging a dinner meant to protect a woman I have known for scarcely 3 weeks, from a man I have despised for considerably longer. Forgive me if my methods felt harsh. I chose the fastest solution available, not the kindest one. The corridor fell silent for a long moment, the only sound the distant murmur of conversation still drifting from the dining hall. Margaret shifted uncomfortably beside them, glancing again toward the corner as though expecting more footsteps at any moment. Julian, she said quietly, you cannot remain away from the table much longer. Crane will notice. Julian nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on Alina. Miss Hartley, I need you to remain in your room tonight with the door locked. Grace will bring your meal upstairs. Tomorrow, once our guests have departed, I will explain everything in full, I promise you that. But tonight, the safest place in this entire estate is behind a locked door, far from Lord Crane's watchful eyes. And if he asks about me, Alina said, if he asks who the woman was that you dismissed so publicly, then he will be told the truth in part, Julian said. That you are a companion recently employed by my grandmother, dismissed tonight for a lapse in manners unbecoming of a formal dinner. It is not a flattering story, Miss Hartley, and I am sorry for that. But it is a story that will bore a man like Crane far more than it interests him. Alina studied the Duke's face for a long moment, searching for any hint of deception, any sign that his explanation was merely a convenient excuse constructed after the fact. She found none. Only tiredness and something else beneath it, something that looked almost like fear, though whether that fear was for himself or for her, she could not tell. "Very well," Alina said finally. "I will remain in my room tonight, but tomorrow, Your Grace, I expect a full explanation, every detail. I have spent 2 years running from a danger I barely understand, and I will not continue living in the dark simply because the truth proves inconvenient for you to share." Something flickered across Julian's face at her words, a flash of surprise perhaps, as though he had not expected her to know anything at all about the danger she was running from. But he said nothing further on the matter, only nodded once and turned back toward the dining hall, his shoulders squared once more into the composed, formal posture of a duke returning to his duties. Margaret guided Alina through a hidden passage that connected the servants' corridor to the eastern staircase, avoiding the main hall entirely. The passage was narrow and dimly lit, the walls lined with old portraits of Ashford ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to follow Alina's every step. She said nothing as they climbed, her mind spinning with questions that had no answers yet, her heart still racing from the encounter in the corridor. At the top of the stairs, Margaret paused outside Alina's bedroom door, glancing once more down the empty hallway before speaking. "I know tonight has been frightening," she said gently, "but my brother is not a cruel man, whatever tonight may have suggested to you. He has spent every day since Crane's arrival this afternoon trying to think of a way to protect you without exposing your secret to the entire county. If anything, his harshness tonight came from caring far more than he is willing to admit." Alina said nothing, unsure what to make of such a statement, and Margaret offered a small, tired smile before disappearing back down the corridor toward the dining hall, leaving Alina alone outside her bedroom door. Once inside, Alina locked the door behind her and pressed her back against the cool wood, finally allowing her legs to give way beneath her. She slid slowly to the floor, her breathing ragged, the events of the evening crashing over her all at once now that she was finally alone. 2 years. 2 years of careful hiding, of false names and quiet rooms, of never staying anywhere long enough to be noticed. And somehow Edmund Crane had still found his way to the very estate where she had believed herself safest. She thought of her mother, gone now nearly 3 years, and the last conversation they had shared before everything fell apart. Her mother's hands trembling as she pressed a small, worn letter into Alina's palm, her voice barely above a whisper as she made Alina promise never to reveal the truth of who she was, never to trust anyone fully, never to believe that safety, once lost, could ever be fully regained. A soft knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. "Miss Hartley," Grace's voice called quietly from the hallway, "I have your supper if you're willing to open the door." Alina rose on unsteady legs and unlocked the door just enough to let the young maid slip inside with a tray of food. Grace set it down on the small table near the window, casting a worried glance toward Alina's pale face. "You're shaking, miss," Grace said softly. "Come, sit by the fire. I'll stay with you a while if you'd like the company." Alina managed a small, grateful nod, and the two women settled near the modest fireplace, the warmth slowly returning some color to Alina's cheeks as Grace busied herself adding another log to the flames. "Is it true," Alina asked quietly, "what Lady Margaret told me? About the man downstairs, this Lord Crane?" Grace hesitated, poking at the fire with a small iron rod. "I don't know the full story, miss. Only what I've overheard from the other staff. They say Lord Crane has a reputation for finding people who don't wish to be found, and that he doesn't often walk away empty-handed once he's set his mind on something." The words settled uncomfortably in Alina's chest, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders despite the growing warmth of the fire. Outside her window, the sound of carriage wheels crunched faintly against the gravel drive as the first of the evening's guests began their departure, their laughter and farewells carrying faintly on the night air, entirely oblivious to the quiet terror gripping the young woman hidden away in the room above. Grace, Elena said slowly, when the guests leave tonight, will Lord Crane be among them, or will he remain at Camden Hall? Grace's expression darkened slightly. That's the trouble, miss. I heard from one of the footmen that His Grace has invited Lord Crane to remain at the estate for the remainder of the week. Something about old family business that needed settling. Elena's stomach turned to ice. The Duke invited him to stay. I only know what I overheard, miss, Grace said quickly, clearly regretting having shared the information at all. Perhaps there's a reason for it. His Grace is not a man who does things without careful thought, whatever tonight might have looked like to the rest of us. Elena stared into the flickering flames of the fireplace, turning the information over in her mind. If Julian truly meant to protect her, why would he invite the very man hunting her to remain within the walls of his own estate for an entire week? Unless, she realized slowly, keeping Crane close was somehow safer than allowing him to leave and continue his search elsewhere, free to return at any moment without warning. Or unless there was a piece of the story Julian had not yet told her at all. The fire crackled softly as the last of the departing carriages rolled away down the long gravel drive, their sound fading gradually into the quiet darkness of the countryside night, leaving behind only the estate itself, its many windows glowing faintly with candlelight, and somewhere within its walls, a man who had spent 2 years searching for a woman he did not yet know was sleeping just above the very dining hall where he had eaten his supper. Elena did not sleep that night. She sat by the window long after Grace had gone, watching the dark silhouette of the estate grounds beyond the glass, her mind circling endlessly through every detail of the evening, searching for a thread of understanding she could not yet find. Somewhere below, in a guest room she had never seen, Edmund Crane slept soundly, unaware that the woman he had crossed 3 counties to find was resting just above him, separated only by a locked door, a loyal maid's silence, and the uncertain protection of a duke whose true intentions remained, for now, still shrouded in shadow. Morning arrived pale and gray over Camden Hall, the kind of soft English light that made the countryside look almost peaceful, as though nothing dangerous could possibly exist beneath such a gentle sky. Elena had finally drifted into a restless sleep sometime near dawn, and when she woke, sunlight was already spilling across her bedroom floor, and a folded note had been slipped beneath her door. She recognized Julian's handwriting immediately, sharp and precise, the letters slanting with the same controlled intensity she had glimpsed in his eyes the night before. Meet me in the Eastern Library at 10. Come by the servants' stair. Trust no one else with this arrangement, not even Grace. Elena read the note twice before folding it carefully and tucking it into the pocket of her dress. She dressed quickly, choosing a plain gray gown that would draw no attention should she cross paths with any remaining guests, and made her way cautiously down the narrow servants' staircase Margaret had shown her the previous night. The Eastern Library was a quiet, book-lined room at the far end of the estate, rarely used by guests, and tucked away behind a heavy oak door that Julian had already unlocked in preparation for her arrival. She found him standing near the tall windows, a cup of untouched tea cooling on the small table beside him, his expression unusually tired in the soft morning light. "You came," he said simply, as though he had half expected her not to. "You said you would explain everything," Elena replied, closing the door quietly behind her. "I intend to hold you to that promise, Your Grace." Julian gestured toward a pair of chairs near the fireplace, and Elena sat, folding her hands carefully in her lap, bracing herself for whatever truth he was finally prepared to share. He remained standing for a long moment, staring out the window toward the gardens below, before finally beginning. 7 years ago, my father made a considerable investment in a shipping venture along the southern coast, Julian said. A venture partly financed by a man named Alastair Hartley. Elena's breath caught in her throat at the sound of her father's name spoken so plainly, so unexpectedly, in a room she had believed entirely unconnected to her past. "You knew my father?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew of him," Julian corrected gently. "I was young at the time, barely more than a boy, but I remember the name well because the venture collapsed disastrously within 2 years, taking with it a great deal of money belonging to several powerful families across 3 counties. Among the men who lost the most in that collapse was Edmund Crane's own father, a man who never recovered from the financial ruin, and who died some years later still convinced that Alastair Hartley had deliberately swindled every investor involved. Alina's hands tightened in her lap. "My father did not swindle anyone," she said firmly. "He believed in that venture as much as any other man who invested in it. He lost everything himself when it collapsed. Our home, our name, everything we had built over 2 generations. He did not survive the shame of it either, Your Grace. He took his own life barely a year after the ships went down, and my mother and I spent the following years running from creditors and rumors alike, changing our names more times than I can properly count." Julian's expression softened with something close to genuine sympathy. "I did not know the full extent of your family's suffering, Miss Hartley. I only knew the fragments passed down through my own father's stories, and the bitterness that Edmund Crane carried forward from his own father's ruin. He has spent years now convinced that somewhere, hidden beneath a false name, the daughter of Alastair Hartley still lives, holding some remaining fortune he believes was stolen from his family and never returned." "There is no fortune," Alina said, her voice trembling now with a mixture of grief and frustration. "There never was. Everything was lost in the collapse. My mother and I survived on almost nothing for years, moving from town to town, taking whatever quiet work we could find that asked no questions about our past. When she died 3 years ago, I was entirely alone, with nothing to my name but a handful of old letters and a warning never to speak the truth of who I truly was." "And yet somehow," Julian said quietly, "you found your way to my grandmother's household." Alina nodded slowly. "The Dowager Duchess found me in Bath, working as a seamstress in a small shop near the pump rooms. She said she recognized something in my manner, something that suggested I had been raised for a different kind of life entirely. She offered me a position as her companion, no questions asked about my past, provided I served her faithfully and kept my history private. I accepted gratefully, believing I had finally found somewhere safe to rest, at least for a while. My grandmother has always had a gift for recognizing people in need of quiet refuge," Julian said, a small, tired smile crossing his face for the first time that morning. "She did not tell me your full history, only that you required discretion, and that I was to treat you with the same respect afforded to any guest beneath this roof. I did not learn of your connection to the Hartley name until yesterday afternoon, when Crane arrived uninvited and began asking pointed questions about a young woman matching your description who he believed had recently taken refuge somewhere in this county." Alina felt the ground shift uncomfortably beneath her once more. "He knew I might be here specifically, not simply searching blindly across 3 counties. He had received information, apparently, from a source in Bath," Julian said grimly. "Someone recognized you before you left the city, and word eventually reached Crane through channels I have not yet fully traced. By the time he arrived at my doorstep yesterday afternoon, he was already fairly confident that the woman he sought was somewhere within Camden Hall itself. My dismissal of you at dinner was, in truth, a desperate gamble to make him doubt that confidence, at least for a short while." Alina sat in stunned silence, absorbing the full weight of what Julian had revealed. Every careful step she had taken over the past 3 years, every false name and quiet retreat, had ultimately led her directly into the path of the very danger she had spent so long trying to escape. "What does he intend to do," Alina asked finally, "if he finds me?" Julian's jaw tightened, and for a moment he said nothing at all, choosing his words with visible care. "I do not believe Crane means you physical harm, Miss Hartley. His pursuit, as far as I understand it, is driven by a belief that your family owes his family a debt that was never repaid. He is a proud man, and a bitter one, convinced that restoring his family's lost fortune will somehow restore his father's damaged reputation as well. I suspect his intention is to force some manner of financial settlement from you, using whatever pressure he believes necessary to obtain it. I have nothing to give him," Alina said, her voice cracking slightly. Nothing at all. Whatever fortune he believes I am hiding simply does not exist. I believe you, Julian said quietly, and something in the simple certainty of his tone eased a small measure of the fear tightening around Alina's chest. But belief alone will not satisfy a man like Crane. He has spent 7 years nursing this grievance, and men who nurse grievances for that long rarely abandon them easily, regardless of how little truth remains at their center. A long silence settled between them, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire and the distant sound of birdsong drifting through the library windows. Alina studied Julian's face carefully, searching for the reason behind his willingness to involve himself so deeply in a stranger's troubles, to risk his own standing and reputation protecting a woman he had known for scarcely 3 weeks. "Why are you helping me at all, Your Grace?" she asked finally. "You owe me nothing. We are barely acquainted, and my troubles have nothing whatsoever to do with your family's affairs." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the fireplace as though searching for the right words among the flickering flames. "My grandmother trusted you enough to bring you into this household," he said eventually. "That alone would have been reason enough to offer you my protection. But I confess, Miss Hartley, that watching you these past 3 weeks, observing the quiet dignity with which you have carried yourself despite whatever burdens you have clearly been hiding, I find myself unwilling to stand aside and allow a man like Edmund Crane to cause you further suffering, regardless of what debts he believes are owed." Alina felt a warmth rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire, and she looked away quickly, unsettled by the sincerity in his voice. "That is a kind sentiment, Your Grace, but kindness alone will not keep Lord Crane from discovering the truth, especially if you insist on keeping him beneath your own roof for the remainder of the week." "Keeping him close is precisely how I intend to protect you," Julian said. "If Crane leaves Camden Hall uncertain and suspicious, he will continue his search elsewhere, and we will lose any opportunity to control what he learns or believes. But if he remains here, under my watch, I can manage the information available to him, guide his suspicions elsewhere, and eventually convince him that whatever woman he heard rumors of in Bath is simply not the same person residing at Camden Hall." "And Lady Seraphina," Alina asked, "what role does she play in this arrangement?" Julian hesitated, his expression growing carefully neutral. "Seraphina's involvement is a separate matter entirely, one I am not yet prepared to fully explain. I ask only that you trust her intentions are aligned with your safety, even if her methods, like my own, may occasionally appear puzzling from the outside." Before Alina could press further, a soft knock sounded at the library door, and both of them turned sharply toward the sound. Julian moved quickly to the door and opened it just enough to reveal Margaret standing anxiously in the corridor beyond. "Julian," Margaret said quietly, her eyes flicking briefly toward Alina before returning to her brother, "Lord Crane is asking for you. He says he wishes to discuss estate business, but I do not believe that is the true reason he has requested your company." Julian's expression hardened instantly, the warmth that had softened his features moments before disappearing entirely, replaced once more by the composed, guarded mask Alina had witnessed the previous evening. "Where is he now?" "Waiting in the drawing room," Margaret said. "I told him you were occupied with estate matters and would join him shortly, but he did not seem inclined to wait patiently." Julian turned back toward Alina, his eyes carrying a warning she understood immediately without need for further explanation. "Remain here until I send word that it is safe to return to your room. Margaret will stay with you until then." "And if Crane insists on searching the estate himself?" Alina asked, rising from her chair despite the fear tightening in her chest. "Then he will find a library full of books and nothing more," Julian said firmly, moving toward the door. "This wing of the house is rarely used by guests, and I have already instructed the staff to discourage anyone from wandering here unattended. You are safe for the moment, Miss Hartley. I will not allow that to change." He left the room without another word, his footsteps echoing purposefully down the corridor toward the drawing room, and Alina stood frozen near the fireplace, her heart pounding steadily against her ribs as she listened to the fading sound of his departure, uncertain whether the promise he had just made was one he would truly be able to keep. Margaret closed the library door softly and moved to stand beside Alina near the fire, her expression carrying the same worried tension that had marked her features the night before. "He means what he says, you know," Margaret said quietly, as though reading the doubt written plainly across Alina's face. "My brother does not make promises lightly. If he says you are safe, then he intends to see that promise honored, whatever the cost to himself." Alina said nothing, her gaze fixed on the closed library door, straining to catch any sound from the corridor beyond, any hint of what conversation was unfolding at that very moment between the Duke and the man who had crossed 3 counties determined to find her. Somewhere below, in the drawing room overlooking the eastern gardens, Edmund Crane sat waiting with the patient, calculating stillness of a man who had learned long ago that the surest way to catch something hidden was never to chase it directly, but to wait quietly until it inevitably revealed itself. The drawing room smelled faintly of pipe smoke and old leather when Julian entered, and Edmund Crane rose slowly from his seat near the window, his movements unhurried, deliberate, the practiced ease of a man accustomed to controlling every room he entered. "Your Grace," Crane said, offering a shallow bow that carried more formality than genuine respect, "I hope I have not interrupted anything of importance." "Not at all," Julian replied, gesturing toward the chairs near the fireplace. "Please sit. My sister mentioned you wished to discuss estate matters." Crane settled back into his chair, folding his hands neatly across his lap, his gray eyes studying Julian with the unsettling patience of a man who rarely asked questions he did not already suspect the answers to. "Estate matters, yes, though perhaps not the sort you are imagining. I find myself curious about the young woman who departed your dinner table so abruptly last evening. A companion I believe your sister mentioned. Fair hair, quiet manner, a slight accent I could not quite place." Julian kept his expression carefully neutral, settling into the chair opposite Crane with the same unhurried calm his guest had demonstrated moments before. "My grandmother's companion, yes. A young woman of modest background, employed to assist with correspondence and household matters. I'm afraid her manners at dinner left something to be desired last evening, and I saw fit to correct the matter publicly rather than allow such carelessness to continue unchecked." "A rather severe correction, if I may say so," Crane observed, watching Julian's face closely. "Most households would simply speak privately with a companion guilty of some minor breach of etiquette, rather than dismiss her before an entire dinner party." "Perhaps," Julian said evenly, "but I find that public corrections tend to leave a more lasting impression than private ones, particularly among staff who might otherwise grow careless in their duties. Might I ask why the manners of my grandmother's companion have captured your interest so thoroughly, Lord Crane?" A faint smile crossed Crane's thin lips, though it did not reach his eyes. "Curiosity, your Grace, nothing more. I have spent considerable time these past 2 years traveling through various households across the western counties, and I confess I have developed something of an eye for young women whose circumstances seem somewhat mismatched with their bearing. Your companion carried herself with a grace uncommon among those employed in service, and I found myself wondering at her history." "A companion's history is her own business, provided she serves her employer faithfully," Julian said, allowing a note of finality to enter his voice. "I trust my grandmother's judgment in such matters entirely, and I would ask that you extend her the same courtesy, Lord Crane, rather than pursuing idle curiosity about members of my household staff." Crane inclined his head slightly, though the calculating gleam in his eyes remained undimmed. "Of course, your Grace. Forgive my curiosity. It is simply a habit I have developed over the years, one that has occasionally proven useful in matters of considerable personal importance." The conversation shifted after that toward genuine estate business, discussions of shared boundaries and old agreements between their two families dating back generations. but Julian remained acutely aware throughout the exchange that Crane's earlier questions had not been idle at all. The man's instincts, sharpened by years of relentless searching, had clearly caught some thread of suspicion, however faint, and Julian understood with growing unease that a single misstep, a single careless word from any member of his household, might be enough to unravel the fragile protection he had constructed around Alina in a matter of mere hours. Later that afternoon, while Crane occupied himself touring the estate grounds under the polite escort of a footman, Julian sought out Serafina in the estate's private sitting room, where she sat near the window working on a piece of needlework with the same unhurried grace she brought to every task. "He suspects something," Julian said without preamble, closing the door behind him. Serafina set down her needlework calmly, folding her hands in her lap. "Of course he does, Julian. Men like Crane do not travel 3 counties chasing rumors without developing a keen instinct for when they have drawn close to their prey. The question now is not whether he suspects, but how long we can manage that suspicion before it hardens into certainty." "I need you to draw his attention further from Alina," Julian said. "Whatever arrangement we discussed before your arrival, I believe the time has come to put it fully into action." Serafina studied him carefully for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "You care for her a great deal, don't you?" "More than 3 weeks' acquaintance would typically warrant." Julian did not answer immediately, and something in his silence seemed to confirm Serafina's observation more clearly than words could have. "That is not the matter at hand," he said finally. "No," Serafina agreed, a small, knowing smile touching her lips as she rose from her chair. "But it will be, eventually. For now, I will do as we discussed. I will make myself sufficiently interesting to Lord Crane that he finds little reason to concern himself with quiet companions and household staff. It is, after all, precisely the sort of distraction our arrangement was designed to provide." That evening, Serafina engaged Crane in lengthy conversation over dinner, drawing him skillfully into discussions of his family's history, his father's unfortunate financial ruin, his own ambitions to restore what had been lost. She listened with practiced sympathy, offered gentle words of understanding, and by the meal's end, Crane's earlier suspicions regarding the departed companion seemed to have faded considerably beneath the warmth of Serafina's attention. Alina, confined to her room once more per Julian's instructions, learned of the evening's success only the following morning, when Margaret slipped quietly into her chamber bearing a tray of breakfast and a cautiously optimistic report. "Lady Serafina managed him beautifully," Margaret said, settling into the chair near Alina's window. "By the end of the evening, Crane spoke of nothing but his own grievances and ambitions. I do not believe your name crossed his mind even once after the first hour." Relief washed over Alina, though it remained tempered by the exhaustion of 2 sleepless nights spent confined within the walls of her own room, dependent entirely on the goodwill and cleverness of near strangers for her continued safety. "How long must this continue?" she asked. "I cannot remain hidden in this room forever, Lady Margaret. Surely Lord Crane will grow restless eventually, and depart Camden Hall regardless of how skillfully your family manages his attention." "Julian believes Crane intends to remain at least until the end of the week," Margaret said. "He has mentioned business in the county that requires his presence, though whether that business is genuine or simply an excuse to continue his search, none of us can say for certain." Alina moved to the window, gazing down at the gardens below, where she could see Crane himself walking slowly along a gravel path, deep in conversation with Serafina, who laughed lightly at something he had said, her hand resting delicately on his arm in a gesture of easy familiarity. From this distance, they appeared every bit the picture of comfortable acquaintance, and Alina felt a strange pang of something she could not quite name, watching the woman betrothed to Julian Ashford charm the very man hunting the woman he had sworn to protect. "Does it trouble you?" Margaret asked gently, watching Alina's expression, "seeing them together like that?" Alina turned quickly from the window, embarrassed to have been observed so closely. "Of course not. Lady Serafina is doing precisely what your brother asked of her, and I am grateful for her efforts, whatever discomfort they may cause me to witness." Margaret said nothing further on the matter, though the small, knowing look that crossed her face suggested she understood far more of Alina's true feelings than Alina herself was yet willing to admit. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. Alina remained largely confined to the eastern wing of the estate, venturing out only during the quiet hours of early morning or late evening, when Crane could reliably be found elsewhere on the grounds. Serafina continued her careful campaign of distraction, drawing Crane into lengthy conversations, carriage rides through the countryside, and evening card games that kept his attention fixed firmly away from any lingering curiosity about the estate's mysterious former companion. Julian, meanwhile, grew increasingly withdrawn and tense as the week progressed, spending long hours locked away in his study, dispatching letters to contacts in Bath and London in an effort to trace the source of the rumor that had first drawn Crane toward Camden Hall. Alina caught only brief glimpses of him during this period, passing exchanges in quiet corridors, a shared cup of tea in the Eastern Library when circumstances allowed, each meeting brief and guarded, conducted always with an awareness that unseen ears might be listening from just beyond the nearest doorway. It was during one such brief encounter, 4 days into Crane's stay, that Julian finally shared the results of his careful investigation. "I have traced the rumor back to a shopkeeper in Bath," he said quietly, closing the library door behind him. "A man who apparently recognized you from a portrait he once saw in a newspaper years ago, published shortly after your father's death." He mentioned his suspicions to a customer in passing conversation, never imagining the information would travel so far or find its way into hands as determined as Crane's. "A portrait," Alina repeated softly, a distant memory surfacing of a single formal sitting arranged shortly before her father's business collapsed entirely, a portrait she had believed lost along with everything else her family once possessed. "I did not know such a thing still existed." "Newspapers rarely forget entirely," Julian said grimly, "particularly not scandals involving significant financial ruin. I suspect there are more such records scattered throughout various archives than either of us would care to imagine, each one a small thread that a sufficiently determined man might eventually follow back to you." The weight of this realization settled heavily over Alina. Even now, even here, safely hidden within the walls of Camden Hall, the past she had spent years trying desperately to outrun continued reaching toward her through channels she could neither predict nor fully control. "What happens," she asked quietly, "when Lord Crane finally departs? Does this danger simply follow me wherever I go next forever?" Julian's expression grew serious, and he moved closer, his voice dropping lower still. "Not if we can convince him decisively that his search has reached a dead end. Not if we give him a reason strong enough to abandon this pursuit entirely, rather than simply delaying it until his suspicions inevitably return." "And what reason might that be?" Alina asked. Julian hesitated, something guarded crossing his features once more. "I have an idea," he said finally, "but it is not without considerable risk, and it will require more than simple distraction from Serafina to succeed. I need a few more days to determine whether it is truly the wisest course available to us." Before Alina could press him further, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, and moments later Grace burst through the library door, her face pale and breathless. "Your Grace," she gasped, "Lord Crane has requested to see the household staff records. He says he wishes to verify the wages paid to recent employees. But Mrs. Whitmore in the housekeeping office believes he is truly searching for something else entirely." Julian's jaw tightened instantly, the careful calm of moments before vanishing beneath a sudden surge of urgency. "The staff records include names," he said, turning sharply toward Alina, "including whatever name you were registered under upon your arrival here." Alina felt the blood drain entirely from her face as the full weight of the danger crashed over her at once. And outside the library window, the pale afternoon light seemed to dim slightly, as though even the sky itself sensed the fragile protection surrounding Camden Hall was about to be tested more severely than it had yet withstood. Julian moved quickly toward the door, his mind already working through the problem with the same sharp focus Alina had first witnessed the night of the dinner. "Grace, go to Mrs. Whitmore immediately. Tell her to delay Lord Crane however she can, questions about proper procedure, missing keys, anything that will buy us time. I will handle the records myself before he ever sees them." Grace nodded quickly and hurried from the room, and Julian turned back to Alina, his expression tight with urgency. "What name did my grandmother register you under when you arrived?" "Ellen Hart," Alina said, her voice unsteady. "A name close enough to my own that I would answer to it naturally, but different enough to avoid immediate recognition." Julian nodded grimly. "That may buy us some protection, but not enough if Crane has already connected the physical description circulating from Bath to the woman he saw at that dinner table. A name alone will mean little if he simply asks the housekeeper to describe the woman who once held it." "Then what do we do?" Alina asked, rising from her chair despite the trembling in her legs. "I need to reach the records office before Crane does," Julian said. "Remain here. Lock the door behind me, and do not open it for anyone but Margaret or myself." He left the library at a near run, his composed formality abandoned entirely in the face of genuine urgency, and Alina locked the door as instructed, her heart pounding wildly as she pressed her ear against the heavy wood, straining to catch any sound from the corridor beyond. Minutes passed in agonizing silence. Alina paced the length of the library, her mind spinning through every possible outcome, every way this fragile deception might unravel entirely in the space of a single careless moment. She thought of fleeing, of slipping out through the gardens and disappearing once more into the anonymous countryside, exactly as she had done so many times before. But Margaret's warning from the first night echoed in her mind, the certainty that running alone, without resources or protection, would only deliver her more swiftly into the very danger she sought to escape. Nearly half an hour passed before a soft knock finally sounded at the library door, 3 quick taps followed by a pause, the signal Julian had arranged with her the previous day. Alina unlocked the door immediately, and Julian slipped inside, closing it firmly behind him, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of relief and renewed concern. "The records are secured," he said, moving to stand near the fireplace. "Mrs. Whitmore delayed him long enough for me to remove the relevant pages before he ever reached the office." He examined what remained, found nothing of particular interest, and has since retired to his room, apparently satisfied for the moment. Alina sank into the nearest chair, relief washing over her in an exhausted wave. "How long can we continue managing him like this? Every day brings some new crisis, some new near discovery. I cannot continue living this way indefinitely, Your Grace, waiting for the next moment when everything finally falls apart entirely." Julian was quiet for a long moment, studying her carefully in the flickering firelight. "I do not believe we can continue this way much longer either," he said finally. "Which is why I have decided to pursue the plan I mentioned to you several days ago, however uncertain its outcome may be." "Tell me," Alina said, straightening in her chair. Julian moved to sit across from her, his expression unusually serious. "Edmund Crane believes your family owes his family a debt born from the collapse of that shipping venture 7 years ago. That belief has driven him relentlessly for the better part of 2 years, consuming his time, his resources, and by every account I have gathered, a considerable portion of his own family's remaining fortune as well. If we can prove to him definitively that no such fortune exists, that your family's ruin was as total and complete as his own, I believe there is a genuine chance he might finally abandon this pursuit entirely." "I have told you already, there is nothing left to find," Alina said. "How does one prove the absence of something that never existed in the first place?" "Through documentation," Julian said. "Financial records from the original venture, testimony from surviving investors, evidence of your family's genuine poverty in the years following the collapse." I have already begun gathering what materials I can through my contacts in London. But such evidence alone may not be sufficient to convince a man as deeply entrenched in his own grievance as Crane has become. Then what more do you propose? Elena asked. Julian hesitated, and something in his hesitation suggested the next part of his plan carried considerably more personal risk than anything he had proposed thus far. I propose that you meet with him directly, he said finally. Not as a hidden companion discovered through careless investigation, but as Elena Hartley herself, presenting the truth of your family's ruin openly, on your own terms, with the full documentation and the protection of this household standing visibly behind you. Elena stared at him, stunned. You wish me to reveal myself to the very man hunting me. I wish for you to control the terms of that revelation, rather than allowing Crane to discover the truth through rumor and suspicion, framing you forever in his mind as a woman with something to hide, Julian said. There is a considerable difference, Miss Hartley, between being caught in a lie and choosing to speak the truth openly, surrounded by evidence and allies who can vouch for every word you say. The proposal terrified Elena more deeply than anything that had occurred throughout the entire ordeal thus far. 2 years of careful hiding, and now Julian proposed she simply walk forward and reveal herself entirely, trusting that truth alone would be sufficient protection against a man who had spent years nursing bitter grievances against her family's name. And if he does not believe the evidence, she asked, if he remains convinced regardless that some hidden fortune exists, waiting only for him to apply sufficient pressure to extract it, then we will have lost nothing we did not already risk losing through continued concealment, Julian said. But I believe, Miss Hartley, that Edmund Crane's pursuit has always been driven less by genuine financial need and more by a desperate desire to restore his father's damaged honor. If we can offer him something else entirely, an acknowledgement of the shared tragedy that ruined both our families, an opportunity to finally lay that old grievance to rest with dignity rather than continued fruitless pursuit, I believe there is a genuine chance he might finally choose peace over continued suspicion. Elena considered this carefully, weighing the terror of direct confrontation against the exhausting uncertainty of continued hiding. And you believe this plan has a genuine chance of success? I believe it offers a chance, Julian said honestly. I cannot promise you certainty, Miss Hartley, I wish I could. But I have watched you carry the weight of this secret for 3 weeks now, and I do not believe continued hiding offers any true resolution at all, only a delay of the same danger you have already spent 2 years running from. A long silence settled between them, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire. Elena studied Julian's face carefully, searching for any hint of hidden motive beyond genuine concern for her safety, and found none. If I agree to this, she said slowly, I will need more than documentation and careful words. I will need to understand precisely what happened 7 years ago, every detail of that venture's collapse, so that I might answer whatever questions Lord Crane chooses to ask without hesitation or uncertainty that might be mistaken for deception. Then we shall prepare together, Julian said, something like determination replacing the exhaustion that had marked his features throughout their conversation. I have gathered considerable documentation already. Tomorrow we will review every piece of it, until you understand your own family's history as thoroughly as I have come to understand my own. Over the following 2 days, Elena and Julian spent long hours in the Eastern Library, poring over financial records, old correspondence, and testimonies gathered from surviving investors who had lost fortunes alongside her father 7 years earlier. Elena learned details of the venture's collapse she had never fully understood as a girl of 16, watching her family's world crumble without comprehending the precise mechanisms that had caused its destruction. She learned that her father had, in fact, invested his own considerable savings alongside those of his partners, losing everything himself when the venture failed, exactly as Julian had told her. She learned, too, of the desperate letters he had written in his final months, pleading with creditors for patience, offering whatever remained of his diminishing assets in partial repayment, before finally succumbing to the shame and despair that had ultimately claimed his life. Reading her father's own words for the first time in years brought Alina to tears more than once during those long hours of preparation, and Julian remained beside her throughout, offering quiet support without pressing her to hurry through grief that clearly still ran deep beneath the careful composure she had maintained throughout their acquaintance. "He was not a dishonest man," Alina said quietly, on the second evening, setting down a letter written in her father's familiar hand. "Whatever Lord Crane believes, whatever rumors have followed our family these 7 years, my father was simply a man who trusted too deeply in a venture that ultimately failed through no true fault of his own making." "I believe you," Julian said simply, and something in the quiet certainty of his voice settled a measure of peace over Alina's grief that she had not expected to find within the walls of a stranger's library. By the third morning, their preparations were as complete as circumstances allowed. Julian had arranged a meeting with Crane for that afternoon, held not in the informal setting of the drawing room, but in his formal study, surrounded by the documentation they had gathered, with Margaret and Serafina present as witnesses to whatever unfolded. Alina dressed carefully that morning, choosing a modest gray gown that carried no pretense of grandeur, only the quiet dignity she had maintained throughout her years of hardship. Standing before her mirror, she thought once more of her mother's final warning, the desperate insistence that she never reveal the truth of who she truly was. But her mother had died believing that truth could only bring danger, never resolution, and Alina found herself hoping, however uncertainly, that Julian's faith in honest confrontation might prove wiser than the fearful hiding that had defined her existence for so many exhausting years. She descended the main staircase at precisely 2 o'clock, her heart pounding steadily against her ribs, and made her way toward the formal study where Edmund Crane waited, entirely unaware that the very woman he had crossed 3 counties to find was about to walk through the door and stand before him, not as a fugitive discovered through careless investigation, but as Alina Hartley herself, prepared finally to face the truth of her family's ruined legacy openly, on her own terms. For the first time in 7 long years. The study door stood slightly ajar when Alina approached, and through the gap she could see Edmund Crane seated near the window, his posture relaxed, unaware of what awaited him. Julian stood near his desk, a stack of documents arranged carefully before him, and Margaret sat quietly to one side, her hands folded in her lap, while Serafina stood near the fireplace, her expression carefully composed. Alina took a steadying breath and stepped through the doorway. Crane rose immediately upon seeing her, his expression shifting through surprise, recognition, and finally a sharp, calculating focus that settled over his features like a mask sliding into place. "The companion," he said slowly. "Or should I say Miss Hartley?" "Alina Hartley," she confirmed, her voice steadier than she had believed possible only moments before. "Daughter of Alastair Hartley, whom I understand you have been searching for these past 2 years, Lord Crane." Crane's eyes narrowed slightly, though a faint smile touched his lips, the satisfaction of a long hunt finally reaching its conclusion. "I confess, I had begun to wonder if I would ever find you at all. You have proven remarkably difficult to trace, Miss Hartley, for a young woman with, by all accounts, so little remaining to protect." "I have protected my safety, Lord Crane," Alina said, moving further into the room and taking the seat Julian gestured toward. "Nothing more. I have no hidden fortune, no secret inheritance, nothing whatsoever that could satisfy whatever debt you believe my family owes yours." "A convenient claim," Crane said, settling back into his own chair. "Though hardly a surprising one. Every debtor I have ever pursued has claimed poverty the moment their true identity was finally revealed." Julian stepped forward then, gesturing toward the documents arranged on his desk. "Lord Crane, before this conversation proceeds further, I would ask that you review the materials we have gathered. Financial records from the original venture, testimony from surviving investors, correspondence written by Alastair Hartley himself in the final months before his death. I believe you will find, as I have, that the truth of this matter differs considerably from the assumptions you have carried these past 7 years. Crane accepted the documents with visible skepticism, though he began reviewing them methodically, his expression gradually shifting from dismissive certainty toward something more thoughtful as he worked through page after page of careful documentation. Alina watched him closely, her heart pounding, unable to tell from his guarded expression whether the evidence was truly reaching him or simply confirming suspicions he had already decided to dismiss. "These letters," Crane said finally, looking up from a bundle of correspondence. "Your father wrote these in his final months." "Yes," Alina said quietly, pleading with his creditors for patience, offering whatever remained of his assets toward partial repayment. "He lost everything in that venture's collapse, Lord Crane, exactly as your own father did. There was no hidden reserve, no secret fortune tucked away for safekeeping. My family's ruin was as complete and total as yours." Crane set the letters down slowly, his jaw tight, and for a long moment the room remained utterly silent, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire. "My father died believing himself deliberately swindled," he said finally, his voice carrying a rawness that had not been present moments before. "He spent his final years consumed by that belief, and I inherited not only his diminished fortune, but his bitterness alongside it. I have spent 2 years searching for the daughter of the man I believed responsible for his ruin, convinced that finding her, and whatever remained of the fortune I believed she carried, would somehow restore what my family lost." "There was never a fortune to find," Julian said gently. "Only 2 families, ruined equally by the same failed venture, each carrying their grief and bitterness forward in different directions." Crane was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving once more over the documents spread before him, before finally settling on Alina's face with an expression that had softened considerably from the calculating focus he had worn upon her arrival. "You lost your father to this ruin as well," he said. "It was not quite a question." "He took his own life," Alina said quietly, "barely a year after the venture collapsed. My mother and I spent the years that followed running from creditors and rumors alike, changing our names, our homes, everything we had once known, simply to survive. Whatever grievance you have carried against my family's name, Lord Crane, I promise you that we have already paid a price for that failed venture as steep as any your family has suffered." Something shifted visibly in Crane's expression then, the hard certainty that had defined his pursuit for 2 years finally cracking beneath the weight of shared grief he had not expected to encounter. He set the documents down carefully and rose from his chair, moving toward the window, his back to the room for a long moment before he finally spoke again. "I have spent 2 years," he said quietly, "chasing a phantom fortune that never existed, driven by a bitterness I inherited rather than chose for myself. I do not know what to do now, Miss Hartley, with the sudden absence of a pursuit that has defined my life for so long." "Perhaps," Serafina said gently, speaking for the first time since Alina had entered the room, "you might simply allow yourself to grieve your father properly, Lord Crane, rather than continuing to carry his bitterness forward as though it were your own burden to bear indefinitely." Crane turned back toward the room, studying Serafina's face for a long moment, and Alina noticed something pass between them then, a familiarity that suggested their conversations over the past week had touched on matters considerably deeper than idle distraction. "You knew," Crane said slowly, understanding dawning across his features. "You knew who she was, all along, and you spent this past week deliberately drawing my attention elsewhere." "I did," Serafina admitted, without hesitation or apology, "because I believed, as Julian did, that you deserved the opportunity to learn the truth of this matter honestly, rather than through whatever harsh confrontation your continued suspicion might eventually have produced." Crane's expression darkened briefly with something like betrayal, though it faded quickly beneath the weight of everything else he had just learned. "And our conversations this past week," he said, "our carriage rides, our discussions of my father's ruin. Was any of that genuine, or simply another calculated distraction?" Serafina hesitated, and for the first time since Alina had known her, Something like genuine vulnerability crossed the elegant woman's composed features. The distraction was calculated, yes, she said carefully. But I confess, Lord Crane, that our conversations proved considerably more genuine than I had initially anticipated. I do not believe I would have listened so closely to your grief regarding your father's ruin, had I not found myself, unexpectedly, drawn to understand you more deeply than my original purpose required. The room fell into an uncertain silence, and Alina watched the exchange between Serafina and Crane with growing understanding, pieces of a larger puzzle finally settling into place. Julian's betrothal to Serafina, she realized suddenly, carried none of the warmth or genuine affection she might have expected between two people bound for marriage. Whatever arrangement truly existed between the Duke and his betrothed, it clearly was not one built upon romantic devotion. "Julian," Margaret said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled over the room, "perhaps now would be the appropriate moment to explain the full nature of your arrangement with Lady Serafina, given everything else that has been revealed this afternoon." Julian glanced toward Serafina, who offered a small nod of permission, before he finally turned toward Alina and Crane both, his expression carrying the weight of a secret he had clearly guarded as carefully as Alina had guarded her own. "Serafina and I are not betrothed out of romantic attachment," he said finally. "Our families arranged this match years ago for reasons entirely political, tied to old alliances between our two estates that neither of us ever had the freedom to refuse. We have maintained the appearance of genuine betrothal publicly, while privately understanding that neither of us harbors romantic feelings toward the other whatsoever." Crane's eyebrows rose sharply at this revelation, and even Alina found herself momentarily too stunned to speak. The careful assumptions she had carried since witnessing Serafina's arrival that first night crumbling entirely beneath this unexpected truth. "Then why maintain the pretense at all?" Crane asked. "Because breaking an arranged betrothal carries its own considerable scandal and consequence," Julian said. "Serafina and I agreed, some months ago, to support one another through whatever obstacles our respective circumstances presented, while quietly working toward a resolution that might eventually free us both from an arrangement neither of us truly desires." Alina's mind raced backward through every interaction she had witnessed between Julian and Serafina over the past week. The careful cooperation, the complete absence of any warmth that might suggest genuine romantic attachment, and understood suddenly that everything she had assumed about the Duke's betrothal had been fundamentally mistaken from the very beginning. "And what resolution do you seek now?" Crane asked, "given everything that has unfolded this week?" Serafina glanced briefly toward Crane before answering, something unspoken passing between them once more. "I find myself, Lord Crane, increasingly uncertain whether the resolution I once sought remains the resolution I truly desire." The weight of unspoken possibility hung heavily in the room, and Julian, seeming to sense the delicate nature of the moment, cleared his throat gently and turned the conversation back toward more immediate matters. "Lord Crane, I hope that what you have learned this afternoon offers you sufficient reason to abandon your pursuit of Miss Hartley entirely. Whatever grievance existed between our family's failed venture, it seems clear now that no true wrongdoing occurred, only shared tragedy that ruined two families equally." Crane was quiet for a long moment, studying Alina's face with an expression that had softened considerably from the calculating focus he had worn upon first entering the room. "I owe you an apology, Miss Hartley," he said finally. "I have spent 2 years pursuing a grievance built upon assumptions I never properly examined, causing you considerable fear and hardship in the process. I am sorry for that, genuinely." "Thank you, Lord Crane," Alina said quietly, relief washing over her in a wave so powerful she felt momentarily lightheaded. "I confess, I did not expect this conversation to end with anything resembling peace between us." "Nor did I," Crane admitted, a small, tired smile crossing his face for the first time. "Though I find myself, unexpectedly, grateful for whatever unlikely circumstances brought us all together this week." He glanced once more toward Serafina as he spoke, and Alina, watching the exchange, felt a small measure of hope kindle within her chest. Hope that perhaps this entire ordeal, born from fear and desperate concealment, might yet resolve itself into something considerably more peaceful than she had ever dared to imagine possible. But even as relief settled over the room, Alina caught Julian's eye across the study, and something in his expression suggested that whatever quiet understanding had grown between them over these past difficult days remained, as yet, still entirely unspoken. 2 days after the confrontation in the study, Camden Hall settled into a quiet that felt almost unfamiliar after the tension that had gripped its halls throughout the previous week. Edmund Crane had not yet departed, choosing instead to extend his stay a while longer, and Alina noticed with quiet interest that his lengthening visit seemed increasingly tied to the growing hours he spent in Serafina's company rather than any remaining business with the estate. Alina found herself, for the first time in weeks, free to move through Camden Hall without fear, no longer required to hide within the eastern wing or confine herself behind locked doors. The relief of this newfound freedom carried its own strange disorientation, as though she had grown so accustomed to constant vigilance that its sudden absence left her uncertain what to do with herself. She found Julian one afternoon in the estate's private garden, seated on a stone bench beneath an old oak tree, a book resting unopened in his lap as he stared out across the grounds with an expression she could not quite read. She approached slowly, uncertain whether to disturb his solitude, but he glanced up before she could decide, and something in his expression brightened at the sight of her. "Miss Hartley," he said, setting the unopened book aside, "I confess I did not expect to find you wandering the garden so freely today." "It still feels strange," Alina admitted, settling onto the bench a comfortable distance from him. "Walking through this estate without constantly watching every shadow for danger. I am not entirely certain how to occupy myself with such freedom after so many weeks of careful hiding." Julian smiled faintly, though something more serious lingered beneath the expression. "I imagine it will take time to feel entirely natural again. Fear, once deeply rooted, does not release its hold easily, even once the danger that planted it has genuinely passed." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the afternoon light filter through the oak leaves above them, before Alina finally spoke the question that had lingered in her mind since the revelation in the study 2 days earlier. "You never told me the truth about your arrangement with Lady Serafina," she said carefully. "Throughout these past weeks, watching the two of you together, I assumed a genuine betrothal, built on whatever affection typically accompanies such arrangements. I did not correct that assumption because I saw little reason to burden you with the complications of my own circumstances, while you carried such considerable danger of your own," Julian said. "It seemed, at the time, an unnecessary distraction from matters of far greater urgency." "And now," Alina asked, "now that the danger has passed, do you intend to explain more fully?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words with visible care. "Serafina and I have known each other since childhood, bound together by an arrangement neither of us chose freely, built upon old alliances between our families that neither of us ever felt genuine enthusiasm to honor. We agreed, some months ago, that we would maintain the appearance of devoted betrothal publicly, while privately seeking some eventual path toward freedom from an arrangement that satisfied neither of our hearts." "And has that path finally presented itself?" Alina asked, "given everything that has unfolded this past week between Lady Serafina and Lord Crane." A genuine smile crossed Julian's face then, the first truly unguarded expression Alina had witnessed from him since her arrival at Camden Hall weeks earlier. "I believe it has, though the timing remains delicate. Serafina's family will require considerable convincing before they accept any dissolution of our arranged match, particularly given how recently Lord Crane's own family suffered such considerable financial ruin. But I have never seen Serafina regard anyone with the genuine warmth she has shown Crane these past several days, and I confess, I find myself genuinely hopeful that circumstances might yet resolve themselves favorably for them both." "You do not seem troubled by the prospect of losing your betrothed to another man," Alina observed carefully. Julian turned to face her fully then, his expression carrying a seriousness that made Alina's heart quicken unexpectedly. "I have never loved Seraphina, Miss Hartley, not in the manner a husband ought to love his wife. Our arrangement was always one of practical necessity rather than genuine affection, and I would count myself considerably relieved to see her find happiness elsewhere, provided I am equally free to seek my own happiness in turn." Alina's breath caught slightly at the weight carried within his words, and she looked away, suddenly uncertain how to respond to the implication hanging unspoken in the air between them. "Your Grace," she began carefully, "I am grateful, more than words can properly express, for everything you have done to protect me these past weeks. But I am mindful that whatever debt of gratitude I owe you should not be mistaken for anything more than genuine thankfulness." "I have not asked you to mistake gratitude for anything else, Miss Hartley," Julian said gently. "I only wished for you to understand the truth of my circumstances, rather than continuing to believe assumptions that were never entirely accurate to begin with." A comfortable silence settled between them once more, though it carried now a different quality than before, charged with something neither of them seemed quite ready to name openly. Alina studied the dappled sunlight filtering through the oak leaves above, gathering her thoughts carefully before speaking again. "May I ask you something honestly, Your Grace?" she said finally. "Of course. That first night, when you dismissed me so harshly from the dinner table, was your urgency entirely strategic, protecting me from Lord Crane's suspicion, or did some part of that harshness carry genuine fear for my safety, beyond mere calculation?" Julian considered the question carefully, his gaze drifting toward the distant tree line beyond the garden walls before finally returning to Alina's face. "I have asked myself that same question many times these past weeks," he admitted. "I told myself in the moment that my actions were purely strategic, a calculated risk necessary to protect you from immediate discovery. But looking back now, I confess the fear I felt that evening carried a weight considerably beyond simple strategy. I had known you scarcely 3 weeks, Miss Hartley, and yet the thought of watching you fall into Crane's hands, whatever his ultimate intentions might have been, filled me with a dread I did not fully understand until much later." Alina's heart pounded steadily in her chest as she absorbed the honesty of his admission. "I did not understand that fear that night," she said quietly. "I felt only humiliation and considerable confusion at your cruelty." "I know," Julian said, regret evident in his voice. "And I am sorry for the pain that misunderstanding caused you, even knowing now that my intentions, however clumsily executed, were never truly cruel." "I have come to understand that now," Alina said. "Though I confess, Your Grace, the events of these past weeks have left me uncertain how to properly categorize the feelings I have developed toward you throughout this ordeal. Gratitude alone seems an insufficient word for everything I have come to feel." Julian turned to face her fully, hope kindling visibly in his pale gray eyes. "And if gratitude alone proves insufficient, Miss Hartley, what word might you offer in its place?" Alina hesitated, the weight of the question settling heavily in the quiet garden air between them. She thought of everything they had endured together these past difficult weeks, the careful protection he had extended toward her, the honesty with which he had ultimately treated her, even when concealment might have proven considerably easier. She thought, too, of the warmth that had grown steadily within her chest throughout their many quiet conversations in the Eastern Library, a warmth she had been reluctant to name honestly, even to herself. "Perhaps," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "affection would prove a more accurate word." Something in Julian's expression softened entirely at her words. The careful composure he maintained so consistently throughout their acquaintance finally giving way to genuine, unguarded emotion. "Then I confess, Miss Hartley, that I harbor that same affection toward you, and have for considerably longer than I have been willing to admit, even to myself." The moment stretched between them, fragile and uncertain, neither quite willing to close the remaining distance that separated them on the stone bench, when the sound of approaching footsteps on the garden path startled them both from their private conversation. Margaret appeared around the corner of a tall hedge, her expression carrying the particular urgency Alina had come to recognize throughout the past turbulent week. "Julian," Margaret called, hurrying toward them. "A letter has arrived from grandmother. She has learned of everything that transpired this week, and she insists on returning to Camden Hall immediately to address the matter personally." Julian rose from the bench, his composed formality settling back into place with practiced ease. "Did she indicate what precisely she intends to address?" Margaret hesitated, glancing briefly toward Alina before answering. "Only that she has considerable opinions regarding your future, Julian, and that she does not intend to remain silent on the matter any longer, particularly given everything Miss Hartley has revealed about her own circumstances." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Julian's face, quickly masked beneath his usual composure, and Alina felt a fresh wave of anxiety rise within her chest at the prospect of facing the formidable Dowager Duchess Constance under circumstances so considerably more complicated than the quiet companionship that had first brought Alina beneath Camden Hall's protective roof. "When does she arrive?" Julian asked. "Tomorrow afternoon," Margaret said. "And Julian, from the tone of her letter, I do not believe she intends this visit to pass quietly." The Dowager Duchess Constance arrived at Camden Hall precisely at 3 o'clock the following afternoon, her carriage rolling to a stop before the grand entrance, with an authority that seemed to announce her presence long before the footman opened the door. She stepped down with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had spent decades commanding households considerably larger than this one, her sharp eyes sweeping across the assembled family gathered to greet her: Julian, Margaret, Serafina, and Alina standing somewhat nervously near the back of the small group. "Julian," Constance said, embracing her grandson briefly before pulling back to study his face with obvious scrutiny. "I have heard, through considerably more sources than I would have preferred, a most remarkable account of the events that unfolded here this past week." "Grandmother," Julian began, "I can explain everything." "I do not require explanation," Constance interrupted, her sharp eyes shifting toward Alina, who felt her stomach tighten under the older woman's assessing gaze. "I require only confirmation. Miss Hartley, is it true that you are the daughter of Alastair Hartley, and that Lord Crane's pursuit of you these past 2 years has finally concluded peacefully?" "Yes, Your Grace," Alina said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Everything that has been reported to you is, as far as I understand it, entirely accurate." Constance studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before a small, unexpected smile finally broke across her weathered features. "Good," she said simply. "I confess, Miss Hartley, I suspected some considerable hidden history the moment I first met you in Bath. You carried yourself with far too much natural grace for a simple seamstress, and I have always trusted my instincts in such matters." "You suspected grandmother?" Julian asked, clearly startled by this revelation. "You knew Miss Hartley's true circumstances before bringing her into this household?" "I suspected considerably more than I knew for certain," Constance corrected. "I did not know the full extent of her family's history, but I recognized enough breeding and quiet dignity in her manner to understand she was no ordinary companion seeking simple employment. I brought her into this household precisely because I believed whatever troubles she carried might eventually find resolution here, under the protection this family could offer, should the need ever arise." Alina stared at the Dowager Duchess in stunned silence, understanding suddenly that the quiet refuge she had believed herself fortunate to stumble upon in Bath had, in truth, been offered with considerably more foresight and intention than she had ever imagined. "And what of the matter concerning your betrothal, Julian?" Constance continued, turning her sharp attention back toward her grandson. "I understand from Margaret's letter that Lady Serafina's affections have shifted considerably toward Lord Crane over these past several days." Serafina stepped forward then, her composure carrying the same practiced grace she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. "Your Grace, I hope you will forgive the unconventional nature of these developments. My family arranged my betrothal to Julian years ago for reasons entirely political, and I confess, I have found myself, unexpectedly, developing genuine affection for Lord Crane over this past week. Affection I never anticipated feeling toward anyone bound to our arrangement. Constance considered this for a long moment, her expression thoughtful rather than disapproving. Political arrangements, however carefully constructed, rarely account for the unpredictable nature of genuine human affection, she said finally. I will not pretend the dissolution of your betrothal comes without complications, Lady Seraphina, particularly given the political alliances it was meant to secure. But I have never believed forced happiness serves any family well in the long term, whatever short-term convenience it might provide. Relief washed visibly across Seraphina's face, and beside her, Julian's own shoulders relaxed considerably, the tension he had carried throughout the conversation finally easing. Then you approve of dissolving the arrangement? Julian asked carefully. I approve of my grandson's happiness, Constance said, provided he demonstrates the good sense to pursue it wisely, rather than recklessly. Her sharp eyes shifted then toward Alina, and something knowing crossed her weathered features. Miss Hartley, might I trouble you to walk with me through the gardens? I find myself in need of fresh air after such a long carriage journey, and I believe we have considerably more to discuss, just the two of us. Alina glanced briefly toward Julian, who offered a small, encouraging nod, before following the Dowager Duchess out through the garden doors, her heart pounding with a mixture of nervousness and cautious hope. They walked in silence for a while along the same gravel path Julian had once shared with Alina, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the carefully tended flower beds. Finally, Constance spoke, her voice carrying a gentleness Alina had not expected from a woman of such formidable reputation. I have watched my grandson these past several years, Miss Hartley, carry the weight of an arrangement that satisfied his family's political needs while leaving his own heart entirely untouched, she said. I confess, I had begun to worry he would spend his entire life honoring obligation over genuine happiness, exactly as duty so often demands of men in his position. Your Grace, Alina said carefully, uncertain where this conversation was leading. I do not wish to presume anything regarding the Duke's feelings toward myself, whatever circumstances have unfolded between us these past weeks. I am not asking you to presume anything, Miss Hartley, Constance said, a knowing smile touching her lips. I am simply observing what has become fairly obvious to anyone paying sufficiently close attention. My grandson has not looked at anyone the way he looks at you, not once, in all the years I have known him. I would be a poor grandmother indeed if I failed to notice such a significant change, particularly given how directly it has coincided with your arrival in this household. Alina felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncertain how to respond to such direct observation. I care for him deeply, Your Grace, she admitted finally. More deeply than I had ever anticipated feeling toward anyone, given the circumstances that first brought us together. But I am mindful that a duke's choice of wife carries considerable weight, and I have nothing to offer him beyond my own person. No fortune, no significant family connection, nothing beyond what small dignity remains of a name that once carried considerable respect before its ruin. Constance stopped walking and turned to face Alina directly, her expression carrying a seriousness that commanded full attention. Miss Hartley, I have spent considerable decades observing the marriages arranged throughout our family and countless others across this county, marriages built upon fortune and political convenience that ultimately produced nothing but quiet misery for those bound within them. I have watched my own grandson endure an arrangement with Lady Seraphina that offered political security, while denying him any genuine warmth or companionship. I have no interest whatsoever in seeing him repeat that same mistake a second time, regardless of what fortune or family connection an alternative match might offer. Then you would approve, Alina asked carefully, of a match between myself and the Duke, despite everything my family's history carries. I would approve, Constance said firmly, of my grandson marrying a woman who has demonstrated genuine dignity and resilience throughout considerable hardship, a woman who has clearly earned his affection through her own character rather than any inherited advantage. Your family's ruin, Miss Hartley, was a tragedy born of circumstance, not dishonor. I see no reason whatsoever why it should stand as an obstacle to your future happiness, provided my grandson possesses the good sense to recognize what stands directly before him. Relief and cautious hope swelled within Alina's chest as she absorbed the Dowager Duchess's words, and for the first time since her father's ruin 7 years earlier, she allowed herself to imagine a future built not upon careful hiding and constant fear, but upon genuine belonging within a household that had come to feel, however unexpectedly, like a true home. They returned to the house as the afternoon light began its gradual shift toward evening gold, and Constance excused herself to rest from her journey, leaving Alina standing alone near the garden entrance, her mind still processing everything the formidable older woman had shared. She found Julian waiting near the entrance hall, his expression carrying a nervous anticipation she had rarely witnessed from him throughout their entire acquaintance. "My grandmother spoke with you," he said, not quite a question. "She did," Alina confirmed, a small smile tugging at her lips despite her own lingering nervousness. "She offered her blessing, Julian, should you choose to pursue whatever affection you have described feeling toward me these past weeks." Julian's expression brightened considerably at this news, and he closed the distance between them with careful, deliberate steps. "Then I find myself considerably emboldened, Miss Hartley, to ask you directly what I have wished to ask since that very afternoon in the garden, before Margaret's interruption denied us the opportunity to speak further." Alina's heart pounded steadily as she watched him gather his composure, the formidable Duke of Camden Hall suddenly appearing as uncertain and hopeful as any ordinary man standing before the woman who had come to hold his heart. "Alina Hartley," he said finally, taking her hands gently within his own, "I know our acquaintance has been brief and born from circumstances considerably more dramatic than most courtships typically endure. But I have come to know your character through the very trials that first brought us together, your dignity, your resilience, your genuine warmth even beneath the weight of considerable fear. I find myself unwilling to imagine a future for this household, or for myself, that does not include you standing beside me. Would you consider becoming my wife and the future Duchess of Camden Hall?" Tears gathered in Alina's eyes as she absorbed the weight of his proposal, everything they had endured together over these past turbulent weeks culminating in this single, hopeful moment. "Yes," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Julian, I would be honored beyond words to become your wife." Julian's face broke into a genuine, unguarded smile, and he drew her gently into an embrace that carried all the warmth and protection he had extended toward her throughout their difficult acquaintance, now finally free to be expressed openly, without fear of discovery or consequence. Word of the engagement spread quickly through Camden Hall's household, and by evening, the same dining hall that had witnessed Alina's public humiliation weeks earlier now hosted a considerably warmer gathering, the family celebrating not only Julian and Alina's newfound happiness, but the quiet, unexpected romance that had similarly blossomed between Seraphina and Edmund Crane over these past turbulent days. As the evening progressed, Julian rose from his seat at the head of the table, raising his glass toward the assembled gathering. "Several weeks ago," he said, his eyes finding Alina's across the table, "I made the difficult decision to dismiss a guest from this very table, an act that caused considerable pain and confusion, though it was born from a desperate wish to protect her from danger she did not yet fully understand. Tonight, I find myself considerably grateful for the circumstances that followed that difficult evening, circumstances that ultimately revealed to me the woman I intend to spend the remainder of my life beside." The assembled family raised their glasses in warm celebration, and Alina, seated now not as a hidden companion forced to leave the table, but as the acknowledged and beloved future Duchess of Camden Hall, felt the last remaining traces of fear finally dissolve entirely, replaced at last by genuine, hard-won belonging within a household that had somehow, against every fearful expectation she had carried for so many exhausting years, become truly and finally her home. The wedding took place in early spring, On a bright morning when the gardens of Camden Hall had finally shaken off the last remnants of winter, the flower beds bursting with color along the very paths where Julian and Alina had first spoken honestly of their growing affection. The small chapel on the estate grounds filled with family and close friends, far removed from the grand, formal spectacle that most ducal weddings typically demanded. A choice both Julian and Alina had made deliberately, wishing to celebrate their union surrounded only by those who had genuinely earned a place in their difficult, hard-won story. Margaret stood proudly beside her brother throughout the ceremony, her earlier worry finally replaced by unrestrained joy as she watched Julian exchange vows with the woman she had come to consider a true sister over these past months. The Dowager Duchess Constance sat in the front pew, her sharp eyes softened with unmistakable satisfaction. Occasionally dabbing quietly at tears she would have vehemently denied shedding had anyone dared to comment upon them. Seraphina and Edmund Crane attended as well, no longer bound by the arranged betrothal that had once tied Seraphina to Julian, their own courtship having blossomed steadily over the preceding months into a genuine and comfortable partnership built upon mutual understanding rather than political necessity. Crane, once consumed by bitterness inherited from his father's ruin, had found in Seraphina's steady companionship a path toward genuine peace, his relentless pursuit of a phantom fortune replaced entirely by a quieter, more sustainable happiness he had never believed himself capable of finding. As Julian and Alina exchanged their vows beneath the chapel's modest stone archway, Alina found her thoughts drifting briefly back to that first terrifying evening, the public humiliation that had felt, in the moment, like the cruelest injustice she had ever endured. She understood now, with the clarity that only distance and resolution could provide, that the harsh command which had once sent her fleeing from that dinner table in shame had, in truth, been the very act that ultimately led her toward genuine safety, genuine belonging, and a love she had never dared to imagine possible during those long, fearful years of hiding. Grace, who had remained close to Alina throughout the entire ordeal, stood among the household staff gathered near the back of the chapel, beaming with quiet pride at the transformation she had witnessed unfold before her over these past months. The frightened, hunted woman who had once trembled behind a locked bedroom door now stood radiant at the altar, no longer running from her past, but finally, fully embracing a future built upon honesty, courage, and hard-won trust. Following the ceremony, the wedding celebration spilled out across the estate's gardens, the same grounds that had once witnessed careful, whispered conversations conducted in fear, now filled instead with laughter, music, and the easy warmth of a family finally free from the shadow of secrecy that had once hung so heavily over Camden Hall. Julian led Alina through the first dance beneath a canopy of blossoming trees, and as they moved together, surrounded by everyone who had fought so fiercely to protect their fragile happiness, Alina felt, for the first time in 7 long years, that she had truly and finally come home. In the months that followed, Alina settled fully into her role as Duchess of Camden Hall, her quiet dignity and genuine warmth earning the respect and affection of the household staff and the wider county alike. She never forgot the fear that had once defined so much of her existence, but she carried that memory now not as a burden, but as a reminder of how far resilience and honest courage could ultimately carry a person, even through circumstances that had once seemed entirely without hope. Julian, for his part, governed Camden Hall with a renewed sense of purpose, no longer weighed down by an arrangement that had denied him genuine happiness, but strengthened instead by a partnership built upon mutual respect, honesty, and love earned through shared hardship rather than simple convenience. The estate itself seemed to reflect this quiet transformation, its halls filled now with warmth and easy laughter rather than the careful, guarded formality that had once defined its every corridor. And though the story of that first terrible evening, when the Duke had ordered a quiet companion to quit the table, only for his betrothed to take her seat mere minutes later, remained a curious tale whispered occasionally among the county's gossiping circles, only those who had lived through the true events understood the full depth of courage, sacrifice, and unexpected love that had truly unfolded behind that single, dramatic moment. a moment that had ultimately changed the course of so many lives, transforming fear into safety, secrecy into honesty, and a chance, desperate act of protection into a love story that would be remembered at Camden Hall for generations to come.